Let us now talk about end-to-end testing of Angular applications. How is this different from unit testing that we have seen earlier? Why do we need to do end-to-end testing, and can't we satisfy ourselves with just unit tests? These are the questions that we will examine in this lesson. We have already examined unit tests in the previous lecture and the exercise that followed the lecture. Using unit tests, we are able to test the individual components in isolation, be it controllers, services, or filters. However, unit tests do not cover the entire picture or do not satisfy the complete testing. Of course, unit tests form the first line of defense against bugs. So you obviously should be doing unit tests on every single component that you designed for your Angular application. The unit test should be frequently repeated. Whenever you change anything within your components, be it controllers, services, or filters, you should immediately carry out the unit test, repeat the unit tests on the components, just to make sure that everything is working as expected. They are very fast, obviously, because you are testing the unit in isolation, but that doesn't address the complete picture. Now, these units do not exist in isolation. Obviously, a controller depends on filters, or a controller may depend on services, and the services in turn depend on backend in order to supply the data to your application. And controllers in turn are controlling and constructing the views. And also you have templates that will, together with the controllers, be able to render the views that the user ultimately interacts with. So unit tests have their purpose and the reason for being used, but they don't cover the entire picture. So this is where we need integration tests and end-to-end tests. What we mean by integration tests is, how do you ensure that a group of components work together to deliver the required solution? So that's one part, integration testing. The interaction among the components need to be tested. Ultimately, the final test of making sure that everything is working correctly is to do end-to-end testing. From the perspective of the user, if the user interacts with your application, is it delivering everything as expected? So this is where end-to-end tests serve their purpose. Of course, end-to-end tests are expensive to do, and so you don't repeat them very frequently. Now, as I said, the first line of defense is already unit tests. So that would have weeded out most of the bugs that might occur within your application. But having said that, end-to-end tests are essential to ensure that your application is performing as required. Let's see how we will go about doing end-to-end tests next. When we look at our testing strategies, we can organize our testing strategies into a pyramid-like approach. You have unit tests that form the base of the pyramid. So they are extensive and numerous and are repeated very frequently. So unit tests serve their purpose. So that is the foundation on which you build your testing strategy. And that should be always done. Whenever you design a component, you automatically have to design the unit test along with that, so that you ensure that that particular component is doing its work as expected. That satisfies the base of your testing strategies. Now, upon that, you build integration tests. Integration tests, as I mentioned earlier, tests interactions among components or groups of components. So they are not looking at complete end-to-end, but they are still how a group of components interact with each other. And then on top of that, you have end-to-end tests, which ensure that everything works together. Now, within this pyramid-like approach, integration tests build upon unit tests. So they are the next level of testing that you need to carry out. And then at the top of the pyramid are end-to-end tests. You do few end-to-end tests, but they have to be done at the end to make sure everything is working correctly. End-to-end tests are expensive, so they are not repeated very frequently. So any changes that you make to your code, unit tests should be carried out as your first line of defense to make sure that everything is working correctly at the bottom. But then once you have completed refactoring everything in your code, carry out an end-to-end test to ensure that the whole system is working as expected. Now, in the previous exercise, we did unit tests. We also did a little bit of integration tests. Now, when we looked at the exercise, we actually did test the interaction between the backend module through the service to the controller. So we use the controller as a way of also ensuring that the remaining two modules are delivering things as expected. So in some sense, we had already dealt with unit tests and integration tests in the previous exercise. Now we'll look at end-to-end tests next. So, as I mentioned, in the previous lecture and the exercise, we actually did examine unit tests in a lot of detail. Also, we looked at integration tests, the interaction between the menu controller, the service, the menu factory that was supplying the data to your menu controller, and the backend, which we marked using the HTTP backend. So we were carrying out integration tests also along the way. Some of those tests were actually unit tests. They were testing to whether the select function was appropriately carrying out the settings of the various variables on the scope and so on. So those are pure unit tests. So they were carrying out testing of the controller in isolation. But then there were some tests where we actually did fetch the data or the mock data from the backend and then carried out the test. So we did both unit and integration testing in the previous exercise. It is very hard to completely isolate the two. So you may have to integrate both unit tests and integration testing into one strategy. It's not that difficult to carry them out, so you might as well do them together. End-to-end tests, that is what we have to examine next. Fortunately, the Angular developers designed their own testing strategies for end-to-end tests. And one of the tools that they designed was named Protractor. Now, who said geeks don't have all the fun? They do have a sense of humor. Angular and Protractor. You use Protractor to measure your Angular application. There you go. So, just because you're a geek doesn't mean that you don't have a sense of humor. You probably have a quirky sense of humor. Enjoy that gift as much as you can. Okay, getting back to Protractor. Let's not divert from the topic. Getting back to Protractor. Protractor is a node program that enables you to carry out end-to-end tests. Obviously, Protractor is written in JavaScript. It enables you to run the tests against a browser. So you actually have a running browser in which the tests are carried out. So that's where you see that it is a real testing in a more realistic environment. And Protractor allows you to interact with your application just like a real user. We will see some of the features that Protractor provides for doing this. Protractor needs to interact with the browser in order to carry out some of these tests. So that is where it needs access to a web driver in order to control the browsers and then issue commands to the browsers to carry out the tests and so on. This is where the Selenium framework that again was implemented at Google is very useful. It has a lot of built-in web drivers for the different browsers that are available. Now, Selenium framework needs to be configured and then appropriately included to be able to issue commands to the different browsers. It takes a little bit of effort, so I didn't use it directly in the tests that you're going to see in the exercises next. Instead, I used the direct connect approach that is provided in Protractor. The direct connect approach works only with Chrome and Firefox. That's good enough to carry out our tests in order to understand how the test should be carried out. So instead, I specify the direct connect so that your Protractor can directly interact with Chrome and Firefox browsers to carry out the tests. Now, the test syntax itself is expressed using Jasmine. We already know Jasmine from the unit tests and the exercises that we saw earlier. The same kind of syntax, so you would see me using describe and it and so on, again in specifying the tests that we're going to carry out. Let's go and examine how we will configure Protractor next with an example. Obviously, if you need to know completely about Protractor, you should be reading the documentation of Protractor. The example that I give you gets you started very quickly to use Protractor, and you can use that to carry out most of the tests in practice anyway. So the code that I provide you in this lesson and the exercise that follows would be sufficient enough to carry out standard end-to-end tests for your application. For other applications also, you just need to configure your tests properly. How do we configure Protractor? Now, Protractor configuration is specified in a JavaScript file. So typically, just for the sake of uniformity, we will name the Protractor file as protractor.conf.js. Again, it's just a convention that people have been using. You can name it whatever you want as long as it ends with a .js. That could contain your configuration. But naming it with the standard convention makes it more easy to understand what this file is actually containing. So we will name it as protractor.conf.js, and that file will contain the configuration that I show here. Now, there are more configuration options that are available for Protractor. I don't illustrate all of them in this example. I just illustrate something that works for our example. This should be good enough to work for most tests that you need to carry out, most end-to-end tests that you need to carry out. So let's examine this configuration briefly. So this configuration, as you see, the way you specify for Protractor is you say exports.config, and then it's a JavaScript object, as you can see. So the first one says all scripts timeout 11,000. So it says after 11,000 seconds, if things don't respond, you just time out and create an error. The second one says specs, and then in square brackets you specify the JavaScript files which are containing the specifications for your tests. So in this case, I store all my test code in this subfolder called E2E, and then so that's why I specify the specs as E2E/star.js. So that way, any .js file that is contained in the E2E will be treated as a test specification there. The third one, I specify I'm only using Chrome to carry out the tests here. You can similarly specify Firefox and other ones. Remember that if you're using any browser other than Chrome and Firefox, then you need to use the Selenium driver and then configure the Selenium driver to be able to use Protractor to control those browsers. We have been sort of using Chrome for most of the purposes, so that's why I'm using the more simpler way to carry out the test. So I specify browser name as Chrome, then the base URL. Now this base URL specifies where your application can be accessed. Now, in the exercise, you will see that I will start up a server which will serve up the application, and I use Gulp for doing that, and it will serve up the application at port number 3001. So that's why I specify the base URL as http://localhost:3001. If you set up your application on a real server, you would specify the URL for that server there, where your application can be accessed. Now, in my case, I am running the server on the same machine, so that's why I specify localhost 3001. The framework, I am using Jasmine. You can use the other frameworks like Mocha and Chai and other frameworks also for specifying your tests. I am using Jasmine, so that's why I specify the framework as Jasmine. The next option says Direct Connect, true. Now this, because I am using Chrome as the browser to carry out the tests, I can use this Direct Connect to directly connect to the Chrome browser and issue commands to the Chrome browser. That's why I specify Direct Connect equal to true. Then the last one, Jasmine node options, the default timeout interval. Again, some configuration that is required for timing out if the test doesn't end successfully. So these are options that you specify in protractor.conf.js file. Let's now look at how you would configure a test. Now in this case, again, since we are using Jasmine syntax, so the code will look similar to the unit test that you have carried out earlier, except that here you need to specify certain things in order to make it do the end-to-end test. Let's look at how we configure this. So I specify describe confusion app E2E testing function. So you see that in describe you specify a string where you can give a detailed description of what this test is doing. So I specify that, and then inside the function I specify the actual test configurations. Beside that, you see that in this code it should automatically redirect to when location hash fragment is empty function. So which is saying that when you start up with the slash, it'll direct you. So the browser get index.html saying that get the index.html. When you do that, the absolute URL should match with hashtag slash there. So that's what we are specifying there. Expect browser get location apps URL to match slash. So that we are expecting in the browser's address bar. Now let's see how we will actually configure some tests. So this is the starting point. We will add more it functions to this particular describe in order to specify the tests. Let's look at some examples next. Here, this code is included inside the earlier describe there. So here I'm specifying describe menu 0 item function, and inside there I'm specifying before each. Again, you know what before each does. Before each test, carry out this set of steps here. So I'm saying before each function browser get, I'm specifying which URL to access. So browser get is essentially specifying to the browser window saying go to this URL and fetch the data from the server at this particular URL. So this will be added in to the base URL that you have specified in your protractor configuration. So when we access with this URL, you obviously know that this will get me to the 0th menu item, the dish at menu 0, which is the very first dish in the list. So it displays the details of the dish details there. So now that dish details info template is loaded into the web page inside my single page application, now I can carry out the tests. So the next test that I am carrying out is it should have a name. So here I am extracting the element by looking for that particular element that is tied to dish.name. Remember that we have marked up the template with the dish.name as the expression that we use to specify the h3 in the template for the dish details there. So I am basically going in and getting the hold of that element and then examining what is the text that is contained inside that H3. So then I say expect name dot get text to equal, and then I specify the text. So this is the text. So even though the heart is inside the label, and even though the $4.99 is inside the badge, when it retrieve the text, it is retrieving only the text part of each of those things. So that I am comparing to make sure that it matches this value. So that's the first step. I am making sure that my dish name is correctly being displayed. Like that, you can carry out tests on the different elements. In the next slide, I will show you some more tests that we can carry out. The next test, what I'm going to do is I am going to insert information into the input box of my comments. I will actually type in information, and then that will result in the comments being sorted by the value that I specify. Then I know what the first comment should contain. Then I will go and check, is the comment being correctly displayed or not. So again, if you want to, in your dish details for the menu 0 item, you can type this you can type in author into the input box to sort the comments, and then you will notice what the first author's name is, and you will see that it is 25 cents. So I am carrying out the test using the Jasmine syntax to automatically do this to my browser window, and then check and see if the resulting values being displayed is properly sorted. The resulting comments are properly sorted. So the first one, I say element by model order text, send keys author. Remember, the ng model attribute that I have associated with the input box there is order text. So I am selecting that, and then I'm saying send keys. Send keys is a way for you to type in something from your keyboard, or simulate typing in something from your keyboard and then put that information into the input box there. So I say send keys, and then within that I specify author. So I am typing in author into that field. Now again, this is an automated way of typing that information into the input text field. You cannot do it manually by typing in on the keyboard. Instead, you are making Protractor type that information into that input box. Now when it is typed in, then the comments will be sorted by the author's name. So after that, I am checking out some details there. So I'm saying expect element all by repeater, comment in dish comments count to equal 5. Remember that there were 5 comments for this dish, so I am checking to make sure that there are 5 comments there. So I specify count to equal 5. Then I am extracting the author's name for the very first comment. So how am I doing that? So I'm saying var author is equal to element all by repeater. So if you are using the ng repeat in your template, this is how you can specify the Jasmine syntax in order to extract an individual element out of that repeated list of comments there. So I'm specifying by repeater comment in dish comments. So remember, the ng repeat directive is taking comment in dish comments as the value or the parameter there. So then after that, the next line, you can see that I'm specifying dot first. So I am trying to examine the first element in this repeated list there. And then I am extracting by binding comment author. So by binding, meaning that this particular field is bound to this comment dot author value in my template. So the expression should have been using that there. So I am extracting out what is contained in there. So that particular HTML element, I am then making use of that and extracting the text in there, and then I'm going to check something. So in the next statement, I'm saying expect author.getText. Remember, the .getText helps me to fetch the text inside that HTML element, which in this case would be the author comments there. So then to contain, so again, notice how I am specifying the text. I say to contain 25 cents. I know that the very first author, if I sort it by authors, is the 25. The name is 25 cents. So that's why I'm checking to see if the get text contains 25 cents or not. That's a test. So when I execute this test, I am simulating user's interaction with my web application in that comments part of that particular dish, and then I'm extracting out the author's name and then checking to make sure that the author's name matches or contains 25 cents there. See how beautifully Jasmine enables you to describe your test. Now, even before you design your application, you can write down this test codes to saying this is what I expect my application to do, and then go ahead and implement the application to make sure that this test passes. That's how you carry out test-driven development. Now, let's see how we carry it out further. So, when you go to the exercise next, which will be on doing end-to-end tests, we will have a set of tests that we configure and execute using Protractor. So we'll look at how we configure the Protractor configuration file. Then we'll look at how we set up the end-to-end tests and carry them out on our application. So that's what we're going to examine in the exercise next.